The dust hung thick in the air that June afternoon in 1884, when Teresa Fletcher first noticed the blind men gathering on the boarding house porch, their canes tapping against the weathered wood planks, their faces turned toward the street as though they could still see the world passing by. She had arrived in Buffalo, Wyoming only 3 days before, fleeing a marriage arrangement in Philadelphia that would have chained her to a banker twice her age, and she carried with her nothing but 2 traveling trunks, a collection of books, and a determination to build a life on her own terms. The boarding house sat at the edge of town where the main street gave way to open prairie, a 2-story structure with peeling white paint and a wraparound porch that caught the afternoon shade. Teresa had taken a room on the 2nd floor, small but clean, with a window that overlooked the mountains in the distance. She worked mornings at the general store, keeping the books and helping customers, but her afternoons were her own, and on this particular day, she found herself drawn to the porch where the 3 men sat in silence. They were miners, she learned from Mrs. Henderson, the boarding house keeper. A dynamite accident 2 years back had stolen their sight but not their lives. The town felt obligated to house them, to feed them, but no one quite knew what to do with men who could no longer work. They sat on that porch day after day, listening to the sounds of a world they could no longer see, growing quieter and more withdrawn with each passing season. Teresa descended the stairs with a book clutched in her hands, a collection of short stories by Washington Irving that she had read a dozen times. She pushed open the screen door and the hinges creaked, causing all 3 men to turn their heads in her direction. "Afternoon," she said softly. "I am Teresa Fletcher. I have just moved into the boarding house." The man nearest to her, his hair white as snow though he could not have been more than 50, nodded in her direction. "Benjamin Walsh," he said. "These are my friends, Samuel Porter and James Cullen." "I was wondering," Teresa continued, settling herself into the rocking chair at the far end of the porch, "if you gentlemen might like me to read to you. I have several books and my afternoons are free." The silence that followed stretched so long she thought perhaps they had not heard her. Then Samuel, a man with a thick beard and scarred hands, spoke up. "Why would you do that?" "Because I love to read," Teresa said simply. "And because stories are better when they are shared." She opened the book without waiting for further permission and began to read Rip Van Winkle, her voice clear and steady in the afternoon air. She read for over an hour, until her throat grew dry and the sun had shifted enough that the porch fell into deeper shadow. When she finished the story, she looked up to find all 3 men leaning forward in their chairs, their faces animated in a way Mrs. Henderson said she had not seen in months. "Will you come back tomorrow?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I will come every afternoon that I am able," Teresa promised. She did not notice the cowboy at first. He appeared on the 4th day, a tall figure leading his horse down the street just as she began reading from The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. He stopped at the hitching post in front of the boarding house, and instead of going inside or moving on, he simply stood there, one hand resting on his horse's neck, listening. His name was Thomas Ashford, and he was 26 years old, though Teresa would not learn this until much later. He had the weathered look of a man who spent his life outdoors, with sun-darkened skin, and lines around his eyes that came from squinting across vast distances. His hat was battered, his clothes dusty from the trail, but there was something in the way he stood, perfectly still and attentive, that made Teresa stumble over her words. She recovered quickly and continued reading, but she was aware of him now, of his presence just beyond the porch railing. When she finished the chapter and closed the book, he tipped his hat to her and led his horse toward the livery stable without a word. The next day he returned, And this time he tied his horse and sat down on the porch steps, his back against the railing post. He removed his hat and held it in his hands, his fingers tracing the brim as Teresa read from a collection of poems by Longfellow. The blind men seemed unbothered by his presence, as though they had grown accustomed to having an audience beyond themselves. This pattern continued for a week. Thomas would arrive in the late afternoon, settle himself on the steps, and listen in complete silence as Teresa read. He never interrupted, never spoke, but his attention was absolute. She found herself choosing passages she thought he might enjoy, stories of adventure and frontier life, poems about the natural world. On the 8th day, when she finished reading and closed the book, he finally spoke. "You have a gift for that," he said, his voice low and rough from disuse. "For bringing words to life." Teresa felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Thank you, I simply enjoy reading." "It is more than that," he insisted. He stood and dusted off his trousers. "These men, they look forward to your visits. I can see it in how they sit up straighter when they hear you coming." "And what about you?" The question escaped before Teresa could stop herself. "Why do you come?" Thomas settled his hat back on his head, but not before she saw something flicker across his face, an emotion she could not quite name. "Because I have been drifting for 3 years, moving from ranch to ranch, town to town, and I cannot remember the last time anything made me want to stay in one place. Until now." He walked away before she could respond, leaving her standing on the porch with her heart beating faster than it should. Mrs. Henderson proved to be a font of information about Thomas Ashford. He worked at the Circle T Ranch, 15 miles outside of town, and came into Buffalo every few weeks for supplies and a break from the isolation of ranch life. He had grown up in Kansas, the son of a farmer who lost everything to grasshoppers and drought. At 23, Thomas had headed west, working as a cowhand wherever he could find employment. "He is a good man," Mrs. Henderson said as she kneaded bread dough in the kitchen. "Quiet, keeps to himself, but honest and hardworking. The ranch owner speaks highly of him." Teresa tried not to think too much about Thomas, but she found herself watching for him each afternoon. He came 4 days out of every 7, sitting on those porch steps with his hat in his hands, listening to whatever story she chose to share. Sometimes she would glance up from the page and find him watching her instead of simply listening, his dark eyes intense and thoughtful. 3 weeks after she first began reading to the blind men, a summer storm rolled across the prairie, bringing rain that turned the streets to mud and lightning that cracked across the sky. Teresa thought no one would come to the porch that day, but the blind men appeared as always, sheltered under the wide overhang, and to her surprise, Thomas arrived as well, soaked through and dripping. "You should go inside and dry off," Teresa said, concerned. "You will catch your death." "I rode 12 miles in this weather," Thomas replied, water running from the brim of his hat. "I am not going to miss the reading." Something in her chest tightened at his words. She began reading from The Last of the Mohicans, a book she had been saving for a day when she needed something substantial to hold their attention. The storm raged around them, thunder punctuating the dramatic passages, but Teresa read on, her voice rising and falling with the action of the story. 2 hours passed before the rain began to ease. The blind men thanked her and made their way inside for supper, guided by Mrs. Henderson. Teresa stood to follow, but Thomas rose as well, blocking her path. "Miss Fletcher," he said, and for the first time his voice held a note of uncertainty. "I was wondering if you might allow me to walk with you sometime, perhaps on Sunday, after church services." Teresa looked up at him, at this man who had sat in the rain just to hear her read, and felt something shift inside her. "I would like that very much, Mr. Ashford." "Thomas," he corrected gently. "Please call me Thomas, then you must call me Teresa." His smile transformed his face, softening the hard lines and revealing a warmth she had only glimpsed before. "Teresa," he repeated as though testing the sound of it. "That is a beautiful name." Sunday arrived wrapped in golden sunshine and clear blue skies. Teresa wore her best dress, a modest affair in pale blue cotton that she had made herself before leaving Philadelphia. She met Thomas outside the small church at the center of town, and together they sat through the service, their shoulders nearly touching in the crowded pew. Afterward, they walked toward the creek that ran along the eastern edge of Buffalo, following a well-worn path that wound through cottonwood trees and wild grasses. Thomas kept his hands in his pockets, maintaining a respectful distance, but he talked more than Teresa had ever heard him talk before. He told her about growing up on the Kansas plains, about watching his father struggle year after year to coax crops from soil that grew harder and drier with each season. He described the day the grasshoppers came, a cloud of insects so thick they blotted out the sun, and how they devoured everything green, leaving nothing but bare earth and broken dreams. "My father died that winter," Thomas said quietly. "My mother followed him the next spring. I think she died of a broken heart more than anything else. I sold what little was left and headed west. I thought I was looking for something, but I realize now I was just running away." "What changed?" Teresa asked. "You," he said simply. "Hearing you raid, watching you give those men something to look forward to, it reminded me that there are things worth staying for, worth fighting for." They reached the creek and sat on a fallen log, watching the water flow over smooth stones. Teresa told him about Philadelphia, about her parents who died when she was 16, leaving her in the care of an aunt who saw her only as a burden and a potential source of income through an advantageous marriage. "I could not do it," Teresa said. "I could not marry a man I did not love, could not respect, just to secure my future. So I took what money my parents had left me, bought a train ticket, and came west. Buffalo seemed as good a place as any to start over." "I am glad you chose Buffalo," Thomas said, and the way he looked at her made Teresa's breath catch. They talked until the sun began to sink toward the horizon, sharing stories and dreams, learning the shape of each other's lives. When Thomas finally walked her back to the boarding house, he took her hand in his calloused palm warm against hers. "May I see you again?" he asked. "Beyond the porch readings, I mean." "I would be disappointed if you did not," Teresa replied. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. Teresa continued reading to the blind men every afternoon, and Thomas continued to attend whenever he could get away from the ranch. But now, after the readings, they would walk together through the town or along the creek, talking and laughing and growing closer with each passing day. The blind men noticed the change between them. Samuel commented on it one afternoon when Thomas had been delayed at the ranch and had not yet arrived. "That young man is in love with you," Samuel said bluntly. "We can hear it in his voice when he greets you, in the way he thanks you when the reading is done." "He is a good man," Benjamin added, "the kind who will treat you well." Teresa felt her face grow hot. "We are only friends." "For now," James said with a knowing smile, "but not for long, I think." They were right, of course. Teresa had known for weeks that what she felt for Thomas went beyond friendship. It was there in the way her heart lifted when she heard his footsteps on the porch, in how she chose stories she thought would appeal to him, in the dreams that filled her nights with images of a future that included him. In August, the Circle T Ranch held a summer gathering, inviting folks from Buffalo and the surrounding ranches for an afternoon of food, music, and celebration. Thomas invited Teresa, and she accepted with barely contained excitement. Mrs. Henderson helped her press her best dress and pin up her hair, clucking over her like a mother hen. Thomas arrived in a wagon that Saturday morning, cleaned up and wearing clothes that looked newly purchased. His face was freshly shaved, his dark hair combed back, and Teresa thought she had never seen a more handsome man. The ranch sprawled across a valley surrounded by mountains, with a main house, several outbuildings and corrals filled with horses. Long tables had been set up under the shade of enormous trees, laden with food prepared by ranch families and town folk alike. A group of musicians played fiddles and guitars, and couples danced on a wooden platform built for the occasion. Thomas introduced Teresa to the ranch owner, Mr. Robertson, a weathered man in his 60s who shook her hand firmly and thanked her for what she was doing for the blind miners. "Thomas has not stopped talking about you," Mr. Robertson said with a wink. "I was beginning to think he had made you up." Teresa laughed and glanced at Thomas, who looked embarrassed but pleased. They filled plates with food and found a spot under a tree where they could watch the dancing. Thomas told her about the ranch, about the cattle drives and the hard work of keeping hundreds of head healthy and accounted for. He spoke with pride about his work, about learning skills that made him valuable, about finally feeling like he had a place where he belonged. "Mr. Robertson has offered to make me foreman," Thomas said quietly. "It would mean better pay, a small house of my own on the property, real responsibility." "That is wonderful," Teresa said genuinely. "You have worked hard for this." "I have not accepted yet," Thomas admitted. He turned to look at her directly, because a house feels empty when there is no one to share it with. Teresa's heart began to race. "Thomas, I know it has only been a few months," he continued, his words coming faster now as though he was afraid he would lose his courage. "But I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. You have given me something to hope for, something to build toward. I wake up thinking about you and go to sleep with your voice in my head. I know I am just a cowhand with nothing much to offer, but I swear to you, Teresa, if you would consider a future with me, I would spend every day trying to be worthy of you." Tears pricked at Teresa's eyes. "You already are worthy. You are kind and honest and good. You sit in the rain just to listen to stories. You make me laugh and you listen when I talk about my dreams. I feel safe with you, Thomas. I feel seen. Does that mean?" He trailed off, hope and fear warring in his expression. "Yes," Teresa said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, it means I want a future with you too." Thomas pulled her to her feet and led her to the dance platform. He was not a graceful dancer, but he held her carefully and moved with earnest determination. They swayed together as the fiddles played a slow waltz, and Teresa rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. As the sun set and lanterns were lit around the ranch, Thomas and Teresa walked away from the crowds, following a path that led to a small rise overlooking the valley. The stars were beginning to appear overhead, brilliant pinpricks in the darkening sky. "I want to do this right," Thomas said. He took both of her hands in his. "I want to court you properly, give you time to be sure, but I need you to know that I am already sure. You are what I have been searching for, even when I did not know I was searching." "I am sure too," Teresa whispered. "I have never been more sure of anything." He kissed her then, gentle and reverent, and Teresa felt the last pieces of her carefully constructed walls crumble away. She had come west seeking freedom and independence, and she had found something far more valuable. She had found home. The news of their courtship spread through Buffalo like wildfire. Mrs. Henderson was delighted, already planning what she would wear to the wedding. The blind men expressed their congratulations and their gratitude that Teresa would continue the readings even as she prepared for a new chapter in her life. "You brought more than stories to us," Benjamin said one afternoon. "You brought hope. You reminded us that life continues, that there is still beauty in the world even if we cannot see it." Teresa had to wipe away tears at his words. Thomas accepted the foreman position and threw himself into preparing the small house for Teresa's arrival. It was a simple structure, 2 rooms and a kitchen, but he repaired the roof, replaced broken windows, and built shelves for her books. He worked on it every spare moment, often staying up late into the night by lamplight. They set the wedding date for October, when the summer heat had faded and the aspens turned gold in the mountains. Teresa continued working at the general store and reading to the blind men each afternoon. But now, she also spent time sewing her wedding dress and preparing for married life. One evening in early September, as they sat by the creek watching the water flow past, Thomas asked Teresa about the books she loved most. "I love stories about adventure and faraway places," she said thoughtfully. "But I also love stories about people finding where they belong, about making a home and building a life. I suppose that is what I am doing now." "What would you think about teaching?" Thomas asked. "Buffalo does not have a proper school. The children learn what they can from their parents or from traveling teachers who pass through once or twice a year. But you could teach them. We could use part of the house, or maybe build a small schoolhouse on ranch property. Mr. Robertson has already said he would support it." Teresa's eyes widened. "Do you really think people would send their children to be taught by me?" "I think they would be grateful for the opportunity," Thomas said firmly. "You have a gift for bringing knowledge to life. The blind men are not the only ones who could benefit from that gift." The idea took root in Teresa's mind and grew quickly. She had loved learning as a child, had mourned the limited education available to girls. The thought of being able to teach, to pass on knowledge and inspire a love of reading in children, filled her with excitement. She began making plans, discussing the idea with Mrs. Henderson and other women in town. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Parents promised to send their children, offered to help build a schoolhouse, pledged supplies and support. By mid-September, the entire community was involved in the project. Men from the ranch and town volunteered their labor, and in 3 weeks they had constructed a 1-room schoolhouse on Circle T land, close enough to town that children could walk but on property that gave them room to run and play. Teresa stood in the empty building, breathing in the smell of fresh wood and possibility, and felt tears of joy stream down her face. "This is really happening," she whispered as Thomas wrapped his arms around her from behind. "You made it happen," he corrected. "You came to a new place with nothing but courage and books, and you have changed lives. You have changed my life most of all." The wedding took place on a perfect October afternoon, crisp and clear with gold leaves drifting from the trees. They were married in the small church, with most of Buffalo in attendance. Teresa wore a dress of ivory wool that Mrs. Henderson had helped her sew, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Thomas wore a new suit that made him look uncomfortable but undeniably handsome. The blind men sat in the front row, brought to the church by wagon and guided to their seats with care. When Teresa walked down the aisle, Benjamin stood and spoke for all 3 of them. "We cannot see you, Teresa, but we can hear the joy in your steps and the love in your voice. We wish you every happiness." Teresa paused to squeeze his hand before continuing to where Thomas waited, his eyes bright with unshed tears. The ceremony was simple but meaningful. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising love and partnership, respect and support. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed Teresa with such tender intensity that several women in the congregation openly wept. The celebration afterward took place at the ranch, with tables laden with food and music filling the air. Teresa and Thomas danced together as husband and wife. And later, as the evening progressed, Teresa found herself dancing with the blind men as well, guiding their steps and laughing at their jokes. As the stars came out and the celebration began to wind down, Thomas and Teresa slipped away to the little house that was now their home. Thomas had filled it with wildflowers, their scent perfuming the air. Candles flickered on every surface, casting warm light across the walls. "Welcome home, Mrs. Ashford," Thomas said softly. "I love the sound of that," Teresa replied, pulling him close. That night they came together as husband and wife, learning the language of each other's bodies, expressing in touch and whisper what words could not fully convey. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, talking about their dreams for the future until sleep claimed them both. Teresa threw herself into teaching with the same passion she had brought to everything else. The schoolhouse opened in November with 12 students ranging in age from 6 to 14. She taught reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and geography, using her books as textbooks, and supplementing with lessons about the practical skills the children would need in their frontier lives. She also continued reading to the blind men 3 afternoons a week after school let out. Thomas often joined her when he could, sitting on the porch steps as he had that first day, listening to the stories that had brought them together. The first winter of their marriage was harsh, with snow piling high and temperatures dropping below zero for weeks at a stretch. But the little house stayed warm, heated by the stove Thomas tended carefully and by the love that filled every corner. They spent long evenings reading together, Teresa often falling asleep with her head in Thomas's lap as he stroked her hair. In February, Teresa realized she was with child. She told Thomas on a Sunday morning as they lay in bed, watching the sunrise paint the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. "Are you certain?" he asked, his hand moving to rest on her still flat belly. "As certain as I can be," Teresa said. "The baby should come in late summer." Thomas pulled her close, his face buried in her hair. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I used to think I would spend my life alone, drifting from place to place with nothing to anchor me. And now I have you, and soon we will have a child. Sometimes I have to pinch myself to believe this is real." "It is real," Teresa assured him. "This is our life, and it is only beginning." She continued teaching through the spring, though she had to adjust some activities as her pregnancy progressed. The children were fascinated by the baby growing inside her, asking questions that made Teresa blush and laugh. The women of Buffalo rallied around her, bringing clothes they had saved from their own children and offering advice both helpful and overwhelming. The blind men were particularly excited about the baby. They insisted on knitting blankets and carving toys, their fingers moving with surprising dexterity despite their lack of sight. "We may not be able to see this child," Samuel said, "but we will love it as though it were our own grandchild." Teresa had to step away for a moment to compose herself. Touched beyond words, in late July, as the summer heat shimmered across the prairie, Teresa closed the school for a break and focused on preparing for the baby's arrival. Thomas had built a cradle from smooth pine, rubbing it with oil until it gleamed. He set it up beside their bed, and Teresa would often find him standing over it with a wondering expression, as though trying to imagine the child who would soon fill it. On a sweltering afternoon in August, Teresa's labor began. Mrs. Henderson and 2 other experienced women from town came to help, shooing Thomas out of the house despite his protests. He paced outside for hours, driving the women crazy with his constant requests for updates. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the afternoon and into the night. Teresa gritted her teeth and bore down when told, grasping Mrs. Henderson's hands so tightly she left marks. Just when she thought she could not endure another moment, a baby's cry split the air, fierce and strong. "A boy," Mrs. Henderson announced, cleaning the infant and wrapping him in a soft blanket. "A beautiful, healthy boy." Thomas burst through the door before anyone could stop him, his face wild with worry. "Teresa, I am fine," she said, exhausted but radiant. "Come meet your son, Mrs." Henderson placed the baby in Thomas's arms, and Teresa watched her strong, capable husband transform into someone she had never seen before. He stared down at the tiny, red-faced infant with an expression of such pure wonder and love that it took her breath away. "He is perfect," Thomas whispered. What should we name him? They had discussed names for months without reaching a decision, but now, looking at her husband holding their child, Teresa knew exactly what felt right. "Matthew," she said. "Matthew Thomas Ashford." "Matthew," Thomas repeated, testing the name. "Hello, Matthew. I am your father, and I promise you, I will do everything in my power to give you a good life." The baby quieted at the sound of his father's voice, and Thomas looked up at Teresa with tears streaming down his face. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for this gift, for our son, for everything. Mrs." Henderson hustled Thomas out again so Teresa could rest, but he was back within the hour, unwilling to be separated from his new family. He climbed into bed beside Teresa, careful not to jostle her, and they spent the night taking turns holding Matthew, marveling at his tiny fingers and the way his eyes tried to focus on their faces. The blind men came to visit the following day, driven to the ranch by Mr. Robertson himself. Teresa watched as Thomas carefully placed Matthew in Benjamin's arms, guiding the old man's hands so he could feel the baby's face, his hands, the soft fuzz of hair on his head. "He is beautiful," Benjamin said, tears leaking from his sightless eyes. "I can feel it. He has strong features, like his father." Each of the three men took turns holding Matthew, their weathered faces soft with emotion. They sang old songs and whispered blessings, welcoming this new life into a world they could no longer see but still cherished. Teresa recovered quickly from the birth, aided by her youth and determination. Within a few weeks, she was back to her normal activities, though she kept Matthew close in a sling Thomas had fashioned from soft leather. She began taking him to the porch readings, and the blind men would listen to her voice and the baby's small sounds, commenting on how they could hear him growing stronger each day. Thomas was a devoted father, rising in the night to walk with Matthew when he fussed, changing nappies without complaint, sitting for hours just watching his son sleep. He continued working as foreman, but now he worked with renewed purpose, building not just for himself and Teresa, but for Matthew's future as well. The first year of Matthew's life passed in a blur of joy and exhaustion. He grew quickly, hitting milestones that filled his parents with pride. His first smile was directed at Teresa during a reading session on the porch. His first laugh came when Thomas played peekaboo with him. His first steps happened on a crisp autumn morning when he toddled from Teresa's arms to Thomas's, both parents crying with happiness. Teresa reopened the school when Matthew was 6 months old, bringing him with her and setting up a small play area in the corner of the classroom. The students adored him, taking turns entertaining him during breaks and vying for the privilege of helping care for him. Life settled into a rhythm that felt both exciting and comforting. Thomas continued to excel as foreman, earning the respect of the ranch hands and the trust of Mr. Robertson. Teresa's school grew as more families moved into the area, and she found herself teaching nearly 20 students by Matthew's second birthday. The blind men remained a constant in their lives. Teresa still read to them 3 times a week, now with Matthew playing at her feet or napping in her arms. The men taught Matthew old songs and told him stories from their days in the mines, adapting their tales to be appropriate for young ears. Matthew learned to recognize their voices and would toddle toward them with delighted squeals, trusting them to catch him in their gentle hands. When Matthew was 3, Teresa discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and in the spring of 1889 she gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah. The little girl had her mother's delicate features and her father's dark eyes, and she completed their family in a way that felt ordained. Matthew was fascinated by his baby sister, constantly wanting to help care for her. Thomas would find him sitting beside Sarah's cradle, telling her stories he had heard at school or singing songs the blind men had taught him. The bond between the siblings was instant and strong, filling the little house with laughter and noise. The community of Buffalo had grown and prospered, and Thomas and Teresa had grown with it. They added rooms to their house, expanding it to accommodate their growing family. Thomas built Teresa a proper library, shelves lining the walls and filled with books they purchased whenever they had extra money. It became her favorite room, a sanctuary where she could lose herself in stories and prepare lessons for her students. On a warm evening in June of 1890, as they celebrated their 5th wedding anniversary, Teresa and Thomas sat on their porch watching Matthew and Sarah play in the yard. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red. "You ever think about that first day?" Teresa asked, leaning against Thomas's shoulder. "When I started reading to the blind men and you stopped to listen." "I think about it all the time," Thomas admitted. "I think about how I almost did not stop, how I was just passing through town and could have kept going. My whole life changed because I decided to listen to a woman read stories on a porch." "My life changed too," Teresa said softly. "I came west running away from something, but I found everything I needed. I found purpose and community and love. I found you." Thomas kissed the top of her head. "We found each other, and we built something real, something lasting. Look at what we have, Teresa. 2 beautiful children, a home, work that matters, friends who care about us. This is more than I ever dreamed possible." "It is more than either of us dreamed," Teresa agreed. And it all started with stories. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one. Inside the house, they could hear Matthew singing Sarah to sleep, his young voice sweet and pure. Tomorrow Teresa would return to the boarding house porch to read to the blind men. Thomas would manage the ranch, and their children would play and learn and grow. But tonight, they simply held each other and gave thanks for the journey that had brought them to this moment. The years continued to unfold with a grace that felt earned through hard work and dedication. Matthew grew into a bright, compassionate boy who loved books as much as his mother, and showed his father's talent for working with horses. He attended Teresa's school, and then, when he was 12, began working part-time at the ranch under Thomas's guidance. Sarah proved to be a spirited child with a gift for music. Thomas built her a small stage in their yard where she would perform for anyone willing to watch, singing songs and reciting poetry with dramatic flair. Teresa encouraged her daughter's talents while also ensuring she received a solid education. The blind men grew older, their bodies wearing down even as their minds remained sharp. One by one, they passed away peacefully, surrounded by the community that had cared for them. Benjamin went first, in the winter of 1892, slipping away in his sleep. Samuel followed 2 years later, and James held on until the spring of 1896. Teresa mourned each loss deeply. These men had given her purpose when she first arrived in Buffalo, had blessed her marriage and welcomed her children. She continued reading on the boarding house porch even after they were gone, opening the sessions to anyone in town who wished to attend. It became a community tradition, something visitors to Buffalo would comment on with delight. In 1895, Mr. Robertson announced his retirement and offered to sell the Circle T Ranch to Thomas. It was an opportunity they had never expected, one that required every penny of savings they had accumulated plus a loan from the bank. But Thomas and Teresa did not hesitate. They purchased the ranch and threw themselves into managing it together, Teresa handling the books and correspondence while Thomas oversaw the cattle and the hands. Matthew took on more responsibility as he entered his teenage years, proving himself capable and trustworthy. Sarah continued her education and began teaching younger students at her mother's school, showing a natural aptitude for helping others learn. On a golden afternoon in October of 1899, Teresa and Thomas stood on the rise overlooking their ranch, watching their children ride across the property. Matthew was 18 now, nearly a man, and Sarah was 13, full of dreams and possibilities. 15 years, Teresa said wonderingly. It has been 15 years since we married. The best 15 years of my life, Thomas replied, pulling her close. Though you still look exactly as you did that day on the porch when I first heard you read, Teresa laughed. I have more gray hairs and wrinkles now. And you have never been more beautiful, Thomas insisted. He tilted her face up to his. I love you, Teresa Ashford. I loved you when you were just a woman reading stories to blind men, and I love you now as my wife, my partner, the mother of my children. I will love you until the day I die and beyond. I love you too, Teresa whispered. You gave me a home when I was lost, love when I thought I would face the world alone. You have been my anchor and my adventure all at once. They kissed as the sun set behind them, two people who had found each other by chance and stayed together by choice, building a life rich with meaning and love. The 20th century arrived with celebrations throughout Buffalo. The town had grown substantially, now boasting multiple businesses, a proper church, and even a small hospital. Teresa's school had produced dozens of graduates, young people who went on to build lives throughout Wyoming and beyond. Matthew announced in the spring of 1901 that he planned to attend the University of Wyoming in Laramie, wanting to study agriculture and modern ranching techniques. Teresa and Thomas were proud beyond measure, knowing the education they had provided, and the example they had set made this possible. Sarah, now 15, had become Teresa's co-teacher, handling the younger students while Teresa focused on the older ones. She still loved performing and had begun writing her own songs, performing them at church and community gatherings. Thomas continued to thrive as a rancher, expanding their holdings carefully and earning a reputation throughout the region for running an honest, successful operation. He treated his ranch hands fairly, paid good wages, and created an environment where men took pride in their work. One evening in July, as Teresa prepared supper in their large kitchen, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about the scared young woman who had fled Philadelphia with nothing but books and determination. She thought about the afternoon she decided to read to three blind men on a porch, not knowing it would change her life forever. She thought about Thomas, the quiet cowboy who had listened for hours and then stayed for a lifetime. The sound of horses approaching pulled her from her reverie. Through the window, she saw Thomas riding in with Matthew, both of them laughing about something, their easy companionship evident even from a distance. Sarah was in the garden picking vegetables, singing to herself as she worked. This was the life she had built. Not perfect, but real and full and meaningful. a life rooted in love and sustained by partnership, enriched by children and community and purpose. Thomas entered the kitchen and wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, kissing her neck. "What are you thinking about so intently?" "About how grateful I am," Teresa said simply. "For all of this, for you, for the family we have created." "Me too," Thomas murmured. "Every single day." They called the family together for supper. And as they sat around the table sharing food and stories, Teresa looked at each beloved face and felt her heart overflow with joy. Matthew left for university that fall, and though Teresa missed him terribly, she was proud to watch him step into his future with confidence. He came home for holidays and summers, bringing new ideas and energy to the ranch. Sarah graduated from high school in 1904 and announced her intention to become a teacher like her mother. She enrolled in a teacher training program and threw herself into learning the latest educational methods and theories. Teresa was 42 years old now, her dark hair liberally streaked with silver, her face lined from years of sun and laughter. But she felt more vital and purposeful than ever. Her school continued to flourish, and she had begun writing down some of the stories she told, thinking perhaps they might be published for other teachers to use. Thomas, at 44, had the weathered look of a man who had lived fully, but his eyes were still bright, and his love for Teresa had only deepened with time. They still walked together in the evenings, still talked for hours about everything and nothing, still came together with passion and tenderness. In the spring of 1905, Matthew announced his engagement to a young woman he had met at university, Clara Morrison, the daughter of a rancher from the southern part of the state. The wedding took place that June, a joyous occasion that brought family and friends from across Wyoming. Teresa watched her son marry with tears streaming down her face, remembering her own wedding day and the journey that had followed. Thomas held her hand throughout the ceremony, understanding without words what she was feeling. 2 years later, Matthew and Clara welcomed their first child, a boy they named Thomas Benjamin, honoring both his grandfather and the first of the blind men who had blessed Teresa's work. Teresa held her grandson and felt the circle of life complete itself in the most beautiful way. Sarah married in 1909, choosing a fellow teacher named Robert Green, who shared her passion for education and music. They settled in Buffalo, and Robert joined Teresa at the school, expanding the curriculum to include music and art. The years rolled on, each one bringing new joys and occasional sorrows. Thomas's mother had long since passed, but they maintained connections with his remaining family in Kansas, exchanging letters and occasional visits. Teresa's aunt in Philadelphia wrote sporadically, and Teresa responded with polite distance, unable to fully forgive the woman who had tried to sell her into a loveless marriage. In 1912, Teresa received word that her books of teaching stories had been accepted for publication by a small press in Denver. She held the letter in trembling hands, hardly believing that her words would reach beyond Buffalo, might help teachers and students across the country. Thomas swept her up in his arms when she told him, spinning her around the kitchen like they were young newlyweds again. "I always knew you had greatness in you," he said. "The world is lucky to have your gifts." The book was published in the fall of 1913, a slim volume titled Stories for the Frontier Classroom. It sold modestly but steadily, and Teresa began receiving letters from teachers in Montana, Colorado, and even as far away as California, thanking her for the resource and sharing their own stories. Matthew and Clara had 3 children by 1914, giving Teresa and Thomas 3 grandchildren to spoil. Sarah and Robert welcomed their first child, a daughter, that same year. The ranch house that had started as 2 small rooms now sprawled across the property, expanded multiple times to accommodate visiting children and grandchildren. On a crisp October evening in 1914, exactly 30 years after their wedding, Teresa and Thomas sat on their porch watching the sunset. It was the same porch where Thomas had once sat on the steps listening to her read, though the house around it had changed beyond recognition. 30 years, Thomas said, echoing her thoughts. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like we have always been together. We have built a good life, Teresa said contentedly. A life filled with love and purpose and family. We have, Thomas agreed. He turned to look at her, his eyes still holding that intensity that had captivated her from the beginning. You know what I remember most from that first day? When I stopped to listen to you read and stayed for hours. I remember thinking that your voice was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. And then I remember thinking that I could listen to that voice for the rest of my life and never grow tired of it. And have you, Teresa asked with a smile, grown tired of it? Never, Thomas said firmly, not for a single moment. If anything, I love it more now than I did then, because it is the voice that has read our children bedtime stories, the voice that has comforted me through difficult times, the voice that says my name with love every single day. Teresa felt tears prick her eyes. You have given me everything I never knew I needed. You saw me when I felt invisible, loved me when I felt unlovable, believed in me when I doubted myself. You have been my greatest adventure and my safest harbor. They sat together as darkness fell, holding hands and watching the stars emerge. Inside the house, they could hear their grandchildren playing, Sarah's voice raised in song, Matthew and Robert discussing ranch business. The sounds of family, of life lived fully and with joy. I want you to know, Teresa said softly, that if I could go back and choose any life, any path, I would choose this one every single time. I would come to Buffalo, I would read to those blind men, I would wait for a cowboy to sit down and listen. I would choose you, always you. And I would choose you, Thomas replied, his voice thick with emotion. I would stop on that street, I would sit on those steps, I would fall in love with the woman whose voice brought stories to life. I would choose this life, this love, every day for the rest of eternity. They remained on the porch long into the night, talking and remembering, planning and dreaming. The years had brought changes, as years always do, but the core of who they were remained unchanged. They were still the cowboy who had listened, and the woman who had read, 2 souls who had found each other and built something beautiful together. As winter approached in 1914, Teresa reflected on all that had transpired since that dusty June afternoon in 1884. 30 years of marriage, 2 children grown and married themselves, 5 grandchildren with surely more to come, a successful ranch, a thriving school, published works, and a community that had become their true home. The blind men who had inadvertently brought them together were gone now, but their legacy lived on. The porch reading tradition continued, with Teresa still reading 3 times a week to whoever wished to attend. Sometimes it was children from school, sometimes elderly folks from town, sometimes ranch hands who had finished their day's work. The audiences changed, but the power of stories shared remained constant. Matthew had taken over much of the day-to-day management of the ranch, allowing Thomas to slow down slightly, though he still rode out most days and remained actively involved in all major decisions. Clara had proven to be an excellent partner for their son, bringing business acumen and social grace to the family enterprise. Sarah's teaching career flourished, and her music had brought new cultural richness to Buffalo. She organized concerts and performances, bringing professional musicians from larger cities to perform for the community. Her daughter, Emily, showed signs of inheriting both her mother's musical talent and her grandmother's love of books. Teresa still taught, though she had handed over many of her responsibilities to Sarah and Robert. She focused now on the oldest students, those preparing to leave Buffalo for universities or vocational schools, ensuring they had the foundation they needed to succeed in an increasingly complex world. On a brilliant spring morning in 1915, Teresa woke to find Thomas already up, standing at the window and looking out over the ranch. She joined him, slipping her arm around his waist. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "About how blessed we are," Thomas replied. "I grew up with nothing, Teresa. Less than nothing, really. My parents struggled every day just to survive, and they died without ever knowing comfort or security. But look at what we have built. Look at the life we have given our children and grandchildren." "We built it together," Teresa reminded him. "Every piece of it together." "I could not have done any of this without you," Thomas said, turning to pull her into his arms. "You have been my strength and my inspiration. You taught me that I was capable of more than just drifting, that I could put down roots and grow something lasting." They spent that day together, riding across the ranch and remembering all the milestones that had marked their journey. They visited the site where the original small house had stood, now incorporated into the much larger structure. They stopped at the schoolhouse Teresa had founded, watching through the window as Sarah taught a class. They rode to the top of the rise where Thomas had proposed properly, 6 months into their courtship, and where they had shared countless sunsets over the years. As they returned home that evening, they saw wagons and horses gathered near the house. Confused, they hurried forward to find their entire family assembled, along with friends from throughout Buffalo. "Surprise," Matthew called out. "We are celebrating your anniversary early this year. 31 years deserves recognition." The evening that followed was filled with food and laughter, stories and songs. The grandchildren performed a play they had written about their grandparents' courtship, getting many of the details hilariously wrong but capturing the essence of the love story perfectly. Sarah sang a song she had composed about how stories brought two people together. Friends shared memories of how Teresa and Thomas had impacted their lives and the community. As the celebration wound down and guests began departing, Teresa found herself surrounded by her grandchildren, all of them clamoring for a story. She gathered them on the porch, in almost the exact spot where she had once read to the blind men, and told them about a young woman who came west seeking freedom and a cowboy who stopped to listen. "And they lived happily ever after?" little Emily asked when the story concluded. "They did," Teresa confirmed, looking up to see Thomas watching her with infinite tenderness. "They built a life together, raised a family, and loved each other more with each passing year, and they are living happily still." The children scampered off to play in the last light of evening, and Thomas joined Teresa on the porch. They sat in the rocking chairs they had purchased 20 years ago, worn smooth now from constant use, and watched their family move through the spaces they had created. "I want more years," Thomas said suddenly. "I want decades more to spend with you, to watch our grandchildren grow, to see what the future holds." "We will have them," Teresa said with confidence she felt in her bones. "We will have many more years together, Thomas. Our story is not finished yet." And she was right. The years continued to unfold with grace and blessing. They celebrated their 35th anniversary in 1919, their 40th in 1924, each milestone marked with gratitude and wonder. More grandchildren arrived, and then great-grandchildren, filling the ranch with the sounds of young voices and laughter. Teresa published 2 more books of teaching stories, cementing her reputation as an educational innovator. The school she had founded grew into a regional institution, drawing students from across Wyoming. Sarah eventually took over as principal, carrying on her mother's legacy with pride and dedication. Thomas remained active on the ranch well into his 60s, finally slowing down only when a fall from a horse in 1928 left him with a lingering injury to his leg. Even then, he continued to oversee operations from the porch, dispensing wisdom and guidance to Matthew and the ranch hands. They grew old together, their bodies wearing down but their love remaining strong. On quiet evenings, Teresa still read aloud to Thomas, her voice perhaps not as strong as it once was but still capable of bringing stories to life. He still listened with the same attention he had shown that first day, his eyes on her face, his hand holding hers. In the summer of 1934, as they prepared to celebrate their 50th wedding anniversary, Buffalo planned an enormous celebration. The town had grown into a small city now, but the core community remembered Teresa and Thomas, the couple who had helped shape the area's character and values. The celebration took place at the ranch, with hundreds of people in attendance. A huge tent was erected to provide shade from the summer sun, and tables groaned under the weight of contributed food. Musicians played, children ran wild across the property, and person after person stood to share stories about how Teresa and Thomas had touched their lives. Teresa and Thomas, now 70 and 72 respectively, sat in places of honor, holding hands and wiping away tears as they listened to the testimonials. Their children and grandchildren surrounded them, a living testament to the life they had built. When it came time for Thomas to speak, he stood slowly, leaning on the cane he now required. He looked out at the assembled crowd and then down at Teresa, his eyes bright with love. 50 years ago, he began, his voice still strong despite his age, I was a drifter with no direction and no purpose. Then I heard a woman reading stories on a porch and everything changed. I stopped to listen for a few hours and I ended up staying for a lifetime. Teresa gave me everything I have. She gave me love and family, purpose and joy. She taught me that a life well lived is not about how much you accumulate, but about how much you give, how much you love, how much you invest in the people around you. I am the luckiest man alive because she chose me, and I thank God every day for the gift of her love. Teresa stood as well, her hair completely white now but her smile as radiant as ever. Thomas says I gave him everything, but the truth is we gave each other everything. We built this life together, through hard work and dedication, through challenges and triumphs. We have loved each other through it all, and that love has been the foundation of everything good in our lives. I came to Buffalo running away from something, and I found the greatest gift I could have imagined. I found home in a place and in a person. I found my true story, and it has been more beautiful than any tale I could have read from a book. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers, and Teresa and Thomas embraced, holding each other as they had done thousands of times over 50 years, still finding comfort and joy in each other's arms. The celebration continued long into the night, with dancing and stories and laughter echoing across the ranch. Teresa and Thomas stayed until the very end, unwilling to miss a moment of this gathering of everyone they loved. As the last guests departed and their family helped clean up, Teresa and Thomas made their way to their bedroom. The house was quiet now, filled with the peaceful exhaustion that follows great joy. Thomas helped Teresa with the buttons on her dress, his fingers still gentle despite their stiffness. She helped him with his boots, a nightly ritual they had maintained for decades. They prepared for bed together, moving through the familiar routine with the ease of long practice. As they lay in bed, the moonlight streaming through the window, Thomas pulled Teresa close. She rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, a sound that had comforted her for 50 years. "Have you been happy?" Thomas asked softly. "Truly happy." "Happier than I ever thought possible," Teresa replied honestly. "You have given me a life beyond my wildest dreams." "And you have given me everything," Thomas said. "Purpose and love and family. A reason to work hard and a reason to come home at the end of each day. You are my heart, Teresa. You always have been." They drifted off to sleep in each other's arms, content and grateful for every moment they had shared. The years that followed were gentle ones. Thomas's health gradually declined, but he remained mentally sharp and emotionally present. Teresa cared for him with the same devotion he had always shown her, reading to him for hours each day, helping him move through the house, ensuring he remained connected to the family and ranch he loved. On a cool October evening in 1939, exactly 55 years after their wedding day, Thomas called his family together. They gathered in the large living room of the ranch house, children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren filling every available space. Thomas sat in his favorite chair with Teresa beside him, her hand clasped in his. He looked around at all the faces, seeing his legacy reflected in their eyes. "I wanted you all here," he said slowly, his voice weaker than it once was but still commanding attention, "so I could tell you how proud I am of each of you. You have built good lives, made good choices, loved well and worked hard. That is all any parent can hope for their children." He turned to look at Teresa, his eyes soft with a lifetime of love. "And I wanted to thank this woman, my wife, my partner, my best friend. She has been the greatest blessing of my life. Every good thing I have ever done, I did because of her or with her or for her. I love you, Teresa. I have loved you since the day I heard you reading on that porch, and I will love you beyond death itself." Teresa was crying openly now, but she managed to speak. "And I love you, Thomas. You have been my heart and my home. Thank you for every day, every moment, every memory." The family surrounded them, embracing them both, sharing tears and love. It was a moment of perfect peace and completion. Thomas passed away quietly in his sleep 3 days later, Teresa beside him as she had been for 55 years. The funeral was one of the largest Buffalo had ever seen, with people coming from across Wyoming to pay their respects to a man who had lived with integrity and love. Teresa mourned deeply, but she found comfort in their children and grandchildren, in the memories they shared, in the life they had built together. She continued teaching part-time and reading on the porch, though now the stories were often about Thomas, keeping his memory alive for the younger generations who had not known him in his prime. She lived another 8 years, remaining active and engaged until the very end. She published one final book, a memoir about her life with Thomas and the community they had helped build. It became a bestseller, bringing their story to readers across the country. On a warm June afternoon in 1947, Teresa sat on the porch reading to a group of children, just as she had done 63 years before. She finished the story and closed the book, smiling at the eager faces around her. "That was beautiful, great-grandma," one of the children said. "Will you read another tomorrow?" Teresa promised. "I will read again tomorrow." But that night, Teresa passed away peacefully in her sleep, a smile on her face. She was buried beside Thomas on a hillside overlooking the ranch, under the vast Wyoming sky they had both loved. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren continued the traditions they had established. The ranch remained in the family, managed with the same integrity Thomas had brought to it. The school continued to flourish, guided by Sarah's principles and Teresa's vision. The porch readings went on, a living memorial to the woman who had started them and the love story they had sparked. Years later, when people in Buffalo told stories about the town's history, they always included the tale of the cowboy and the woman who read aloud. They talked about how a simple act of kindness had bloomed into a love that shaped an entire community. They pointed to the school and the ranch and the generations of family as evidence that true love, built on respect and partnership and shared dreams, could create a legacy that lasted far beyond a single lifetime. And on quiet evenings, if you visited the old ranch house and stood on the porch where it all began, you could almost hear the echo of a woman's voice reading stories and a cowboy listening with his whole heart. Two souls who found each other in the Wild West and built something eternal together. Their love story had ended, but the ripples of it continued, touching lives and inspiring others to believe in the power of connection, in the beauty of partnership, in the enduring strength of love freely given and gratefully received. The story of Teresa and Thomas became legend, told and retold, always ending the same way, with two people who started as strangers, became friends through shared stories, fell deeply in love, and spent a lifetime building something beautiful together. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the simplest moments, that listening can be an act of love, and that the right person can turn a porch into a palace and a lifetime into a love story for the ages.